We've had the January update for nearly a month now, so I think it's probably a good time to step back and look at the changes to the game and kind of see where we think that they've landed. The question is, how much has Mark 4.5 improved the game? My name is Ryan. I used to be good at Warmachine. Welcome to Spell Rack. We're about a month into the 2026 update for Warmachine. So let's take a look at how the game feels. On an overall global view, I'm loving it. I think Warmachine is in a fantastic place. I think the models are really well balanced. I think the rules are great. And I like the global changes that have been made to the game. The game feels really good. One thing I would note from my own personal experience is I would say I've played 10% of my games in Warmachine with the spell rack, right? 90% of my games I played during Mark II and at the very beginning of Mark III. I've only been back into the game for a year now and I haven't been playing as much. So the spell rack to me was still something new. You jump back into the game, you get used to the new Mark IV rules with unit movements and all that stuff, and you pretty quickly get used to the spell rack. And maybe it lends you to forgetting what Warmachine used to feel like. Now, with the spell rack removed, we're back to the Warmachine that I knew. It's static warcasters with their abilities, their feats, and their spells. And so now I've spent the last month building lists and looking at other lists, warcasters, warlocks, and taking the caster in their totality, knowing that they don't have an edit button right before the match begins. I'm not analyzing a spell list and a warcaster. I'm just looking at the warcaster. It's been really nice to just look at a warcaster and look at his or her card and see what they do. I feel like it does streamline the game, and the design spaces are still open but a little bit more tied together. Factions still feel like they have tremendous diversity in optionality. There are so many tools inside of each army that individual tools inside of your list can answer problem matchups. They can shore up weaknesses or create a skew for yourself. You don't need the spell rack to do that or to cover that up. You can do that inside of list construction. So I've really enjoyed list construction. I've really enjoyed the analyzing of the casters to answer specific problems that I think my opponents are asking of me. And I've really enjoyed looking at my casters so that I can ask a hard question to my opponents. The spell rack being gone now honestly just feels like it's part of the game. And maybe I've adapted to that a little bit quicker because, again, 90% of the games that I've played in Warmachine have been without a spell rack. I'm used to static casters and static lists. All that also being said, I think that SFG did a really good job in allocating spells to the different warcasters and warlocks. As I look at them, they all feel properly themed, like spells don't really seem out of sorts or out of place. There's an occasional place where we would have looked at how we played the caster in the prior year and you thought, well, maybe why did they get this? But everything feels pretty well balanced. And when you're looking for answers to certain questions, you find them, and you probably have 2 or 3 different casters that will answer any given problem. It's just what do you bring for the rest of the list? So for me, I've really enjoyed this. I've enjoyed the maybe matchup problems that it creates. I feel like right now I am more heavily leaning into my second list as I'm trying to think through problematic matchups and ways to solve the metas. And again, what questions am I asking of my opponent? I'm looking at both of my lists thinking, I need to utilize the tools that both of my warcasters and both full lists bring me because I just can't have one catch all. I am curious to see going forward throughout the year, how much more diversity do we see in casters? Do we see something like a Horusk take over a faction where he is the vast majority of the games played? Or are we going to see a more significant distribution of games played over multiple casters because you end up having to bring your second list into 30 or 40% of your games as opposed to 10 or 20% of your games. And so it just opens up the factions quite a bit. All right, let's talk lethality now. Specifically, let's talk about Mat and Rat drops, right? How do games feel? Do they feel choppy? Do they feel like your units can't kill anything? Or what are we doing? My experience, I've definitely experienced the drop in lethality. There's a lot more times where I'll put a heavy into something and I'm Mat 6, I'm not Mat 7. Or I'll commit a unit and maybe they're Mat 6 or not Mat 7. And then, of course, a lot of rats have gone from, say, 6s to 5s. and you start to feel it, right? There are places where you can boost and it doesn't really matter. There are more places where you're just trying to YOLO eights or nines trying to hit something. And it's just a game that you're playing. You're going to try to do that, and it is what it is. While sometimes it feels hard to answer your opponent's problems, this guy's defense 13 and I'm only mat 6. I don't like 7s. I'd much rather be rolling 6s. And maybe that is a little bit harder on your game, and maybe you don't kill that unit that you intended to kill. At the same time, though, there's been lots of times where I've put a unit somewhere and I expect them to die. But that was an old expectation. With the current game, I've put cats from dusk, right? 13, 17. And my opponent has waded into the cats and they don't die like I expected them to. And maybe it's because they ended up missing a couple of attacks. Maybe it's because they don't crack armor, whatever it is, they're there and they survive. And so I end up holding on to a point that I didn't think I was going to hold on to, or I end up surviving some gunfire that I didn't think I was going to. So it does feel very balanced to me. The game feels like, it doesn't feel like I was nerfed, right? There are times where I feel nerfed, but then there's other times where I feel buffed. And again, right, it's just because all the mats and rats came down across the field. And so I have enjoyed the lethality change. Everything not being as killy allows you more to, it's not a piece trade aspect, but it's more of a threat assessment, right? I'm going to put a unit out there and maybe you can kill it if you overcommit resources. But if you overcommit resources, then maybe your left flank is going to collapse. Maybe you can't stand on that objective, right? It asks more questions, I feel like, because you need to bring more resources to bear to answer the same problems. And if you are bringing all those resources, you're not allocating resources somewhere else. And so I have enjoyed the pace of the game as I've gone through games with the lower lethality. The other thing I expected with lower lethality was that I thought games would take long, right? What I just described to you is there's times where I'll put my heavy into something and I thought it was going to die and it didn't. And there's times where I've put my units on objectives and they don't die like I thought they would. What is interesting, though, is I don't feel like games are taking longer, which to me is counterintuitive. If lethality is down, games should take longer. But what I do feel like it lends itself towards is you might get a little bit more tar pitted at times. And so you're just kind of rolling dice back and forth. And maybe you're taking that objective, or maybe you just have two units that are locked in combat and you have two mat 6 units and your defense 13 or 14, you have a hard time killing each other. And so nobody scores those objectives. And maybe you just can stagnate in one spot for a little bit longer. But for whatever reason, it feels like the rest of the map opens up, right? The Steamrollers have done such a good job of spreading the game out. And I really do think that Warmachine is best played on a 4x4 table, not a 2x2 square in the middle of the field. And so having games spread out over that larger table means that you're having more micro interactions instead of just your army crashing into your opponents. And so while one objective might get bogged down a little bit in lower lethality, there might be other places where you're still able to clear off an objective just fine. You're able to push. Maybe in the past, you can fail to score an objective, but at the same time, your opponent fails to score an objective. And so if it's a scenario where you're up 4-2 on CPs, maybe it stays 4-2 because your opponent couldn't crack back. So our VPs end up being lower, all things considered equal, right? If we were playing the same Steamroller pack as last year, do people score fewer victory points, but you end up with the same deltas? And it kind of feels like that's where we're at. So in all honesty, the lower lethality feels pretty good to me. Like I said, I feel like there's another factor of the game that is not just, can I put my piece in a spot where it doesn't die? Because in the past, you would just assume it's dead, right? Now it's, can I put my piece in a position where I know it's going to take damage, but it's not going to get picked up. I know I can put these pieces here and I will contest this objective. Period, full stop. Unless dice go wonky, I'm going to contest this. And so it changes the game a little bit. It does feel a little bit more dynamic. I mentioned this already, but I think the Steamroller packet feels pretty good. I feel like the tempo of the game from before that I really enjoyed has been maintained. Games can last a little while, but you're not always clocking out. And games don't feel like they're also ending in 30 minutes because, it's so easy to just assassinate people. So looking at the Steamroller packet, I think they've done a really good job of spreading out the map. Like I said, Warmachine is better played on a 4x4 table and not just in the middle. And so these scenarios are doing that really well. I think there are some analyses that I've personally done myself on lists and characters and warlocks And this ability seems really good, but it's restricted to a finite amount of space. Take Windwall, right? Windwall was a great spell last year at 8 inches. Now it's only 3 inches. And if scenarios also got wider, that is an additional nerf to Windwall. And so, certain circumstances where maybe you thought that would have been more impactful in the game or a brick list would be important, a lot of times lists that require layers and overlapping of rules, it's harder to play those lists. Independent units that get to fan out are actually going to thrive. I do think that this does leave a good place for guns. For as much as guns were nerfed, you can have a centralized unit with guns, and then they can still shoot to the left or the right hand side of the field and still, affect a lot of the table. And so there's a little bit of a benefit there. Overall, though, like I said, to me, the tempo on Steamroller is the most important part. And the way that tempo factors in to the rules and the lethality of the game, tells you what is the average playtime of a game of Warmachine. I think that was good in 2025, and I don't really think that that has changed for 2026, which is something I'm very glad to see because, again, with lower lethality, I was worried about games taking an extra 10 minutes. I also find that the scenarios so far are pretty engaging and pretty lively. The only one I've had a little bit of issues with is the one where the scenarios tick down and they blow up. In my case, they haven't blown up yet. Just, controlling the middle of the battlefield where we end up fighting over it with a little bit less lethality and nobody's controlling it. I end up rolling a D3 so that one objective goes down by one. And if you happen to roll pretty evenly killed dice, you might end up with three objectives that go down to two or three or something like that. And I haven't had them blow up yet. Otherwise, I think the Steamroller packet has been really good. I think it's engaging and exciting. I've really enjoyed the different scenarios, both the existing ones that we've kept as well as the new ones. And I find myself thinking about lists a lot, even when I am approaching scenarios. One of these scenarios has 440s in it and they're spread out wide. Okay, how do I want to play that, right? I think a lot of people look at that and say, I'm going to play on the left hand side of the map, right? I'm going to get my own 40s and I'm going to score the 50s in the middle or contest the 50s in the middle. I'm going to assume my opponent's going to do the same thing and then we'll kind of meet in the middle. I've had pretty good success, though, in being able to actually approach the entire side of the table. Rather than just going to the left and then meeting in the middle and then kind of going at a diagonal, I tried to hit all three lanes, left, center, right, at the same time, and have been able to put pretty severe pressure on my opponents. And that's just a factor of the way one of my lists is. I'm running sort of an infantry spam list for one of my lists. And when I've got 6, 7, 8 units, it makes it easy to go wide. Now, in my case, I am light on cohort models. I have 2 arc nodes in that list. So my presence into the middle is a little bit less. I can still do a lot of damage and threat with my units, and then I go leave one of my arc nodes on the points. So it allows me to clear objectives still pretty efficiently and then still score them efficiently. I don't have heavies running around. So I've really enjoyed being able to design lists around the new steamrollers. I guess, in summary, I've said it already, but Mark 4.5 feels really good. I like how many things are playable in the game. I've been totally okay with the removal of spell racks. I've been good with the lethality changes, and I've enjoyed Steamroller so far. Again, we're only a month in. We'll see how the meta changes and games change. And, one of the things I was worried about is, are we going to see more skew lists? Because you can't answer a skew list as well when you just have static lists. And so if somebody brings a double colossal list, maybe you just auto lose. Or maybe we all need to be designing to crack armor. Right? There's armor that's presented in a lot of different places. I did a review of Old Umbry lists earlier this week and talked about having an armor 24 heavy. If you put a 1324 heavy in front of somebody, it's not that dissimilar from trying to kill a colossal. And so you definitely need a list that can answer that sort of stuff. And so people just need to work that into their pairings. And if you're mindful of that when you're building your lists, you're not going to auto lose on a stat check. All right, everyone. Hope that summary is helpful. Would love to hear how you're finding Mark 4.5. Leave a comment if you'd like, and look forward to talking to you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.